Hello everyone and welcome to the Art of Teaching Art. I'm Mrs. Darby and today I'm going to show you how to do a watercolour painting of still life items. So I've taken a photograph and I have edited it using the Picsart app, and that's to change the colours to make them a little bit more interesting for watercolour. My next stage is to draw out the image, so I've done that in pencil first of all. Now you can do that however you want to, so using graphite transfer, tracing it, or using gridding to create your image first of all. Now what we're trying to do with this is make sure that we have a variety of colours, we're looking carefully at the colours that we're using, and we're making sure we've got the highlights, and then we're building up layers, starting with the lightest layers and building up to the darkest layers to create a kind of accurate painting, but with nice vibrant colours. So the things that you will need are a watercolour palette, some water, some brushes, and then potentially some watercolour pencils, although you can do without these if you need to. So let's get started. So just starting off, going over the pencil lines with a rubber to just lighten them up a bit so they don't show through with the watercolour, and then using the watercolour pencils to mark on the highlights. So just going round with the colour that's relevant to the colour that is the object is, so using blue on the blue, yellow on the yellow, and I'm just marking the highlights to make sure that those areas I don't paint over with the watercolour. Now just going on to the ribbon, so with this one I'm doing something slightly different. I'm just marking the dark areas ready for underpainting later. Now moving on to my paints, I'm going to do the blue bottle first. So I'm just making up a watery blue colour just so it's lighter, to just cover the whole area of the blue bottle with. So I'm just going over that now, so just with a little bit of water, neatly working over the whole of the surface of the bottle. And then I'm working back in with some darker blue, so just looking at the dark areas on the bottle and going back over those areas. Now this is a wet on wet technique, so the colours will slightly bleed into each other, but that's a really lovely effect for this part of the painting. So just continuing adding those darker areas of blue, and now working over the top with a red, so I can see elements of red and purple in the bottle there, so I'm just adding those on now. So now I'm just adding in some of the shapes at the back of the bottle, so making that colour a little bit more intense and a little bit more like the image, to just make it a little bit brighter and bolder, and blending in some of the areas I've already added. So now just adding some darker blues, and so now it's dry a little bit, I'm adding some darker bits. So while that dries, I'm just going to move on to the green and yellow pot above it. So again, I'm starting the same with a light yellow wash all the way over. So just covering all the surfaces there to make sure I can do wet on wet technique. And now I'm adding the green just around the edges, so I'm looking carefully at the image again just to add that lighter bit of green, and I'm blending that into the yellow that I've just added. So just finishing off adding that green, and now I'm adding some more intense colour just in selected areas and blending that in with just a wet brush, adding that to the rim as well. Now the blue bottle's dry, I can go back to that, and I'm adding the darker areas. So I'm mixing black with the dark blue and working over the top, just adding the darker areas. I'm using quite a thin brush to get nice sharp edges with this. So again, just working over, really carefully working around the highlights and adding the details as well, and then working into the bottle to create that shadow at the bottom. So again, just working over the details. So it's really important with this that you build up light layers first of all, and then build in the darker areas, taking your time to get it right. So just making those colours intense in the background of the bottle. So now moving back to the green and yellow pot, so I'm adding the darker brown and red tones to the centre of the highlights. It was a bit strange adding that there because it felt like it didn't really belong, but it's what the picture looks like, so I was just copying what I could see. And adding some of the darker green areas now, so again building up the layers that I can see with the piece to create the overall vibrancy that I can see within the pot. So just finishing off adding some detail to the blue bottle now, so you can see I'm moving between the two, and that's just giving time for the other piece to dry while I move on to the next one. And now I'm moving on to the Mannequin Doll. So again, I'm doing a base layer with the yellow and beige colour and working over the top with the red. I'm making this a little bit more intense than it actually is because I want those bright warm colours as a contrast to the green and blue on the other side. So with this, I'm just adding the red round the edge and then blending it in with just a damp brush. So again, a surface layer over the body, and working on top. Now this was a bit strange here because it moved from red into purple on the picture, which is a bit of a weird clash to kind of make, but I just went with the image, and actually in the end it turned out really well. So some of these areas are very much unfinished at this stage. I'm going to work back into them later. So now working back on the yellow and green pot, I'm adding those darker areas in with the black, just working over to add the darkest bits. I've just got out a thinner brush there so I can just add a few more details. So just make sure you're using the right kind of brush for the bit that you're doing. And I think now it's just making the colour stand out and be a lot more vibrant. It creates that contrast in tones on this piece. So really liking that so far. So just adding the final details to the pot there, adding the lines that I can see. So this is a really important stage. It needs to be dry to do this, otherwise it will bleed all over your work and it might ruin it. So just adding those final details around the highlights as well to just make sure I've got that intensity in the colour there. So just finishing that bit off. So now moving back on to the mannequin, I'm adding more intense red to the head there, and then I'm thinking about the shadow under the neck. So really paying close attention to the shadows and dark areas on this mannequin, and then creating a lovely blend between the red and the purple on the chest there, and a blend across the top area of the chest as well, and then adding brown to create the shadow. So with each area here I add brown to create the shadows, use the yellow as a base colour and the red to create the kind of mid-tone areas. So I'm just putting base layers down first of all for all these areas, and then I'll go back later on to blend and add more detail. So really important to try a variety of techniques using base layers, building up tones and things like that. So just finishing that off on the other arm, getting the kind of base layers in so I can go back to it later once it's dry. That allows me to add a little bit more detail in, and I'm just really paying close attention to the shadows that I can see. Just finishing off the bottom there. Now I'm creating a shadow next to the arm so that there's a really clear distinction between the arm and the blue bottle there, and I'm just making sure that's nice and sharp with my brush there. So now I'm doing some underpainting, so I'm using the brown on the ribbon to paint in where the shadows are. You'll see how this kind of comes together later. It's much easier to do it this way, so I'm kind of doing it in the opposite way, working with darker colours first. So just using the dark brown to add all those darker areas in. First of all, I'm adding the darker areas and then blending towards the edges for this, and then just going nice and neatly around the hand there. So now I'm just finishing off the mannequin body, so using the red again to create that kind of mid-tone, working over areas to make the colours more intense, to add those fine details, to add the shadows and the darker areas of tone, to just refine the piece and blend over it. So I'm using a damp brush a lot of the time to blend the colours together, and layering on the brown and red to create the detail that I can see in the piece. Being really careful here not to make it too dark on the hands because they are really quite yellow and I want to add that detail in. So just adding the final shadows, making sure that those colours are nice and vibrant, and adding some lines to just cover up any pencil lines that I can still see. So now just adding that final screw to the top of the arm and moving on to the ribbon. So with the ribbon I'm using the pink and the red, and I'm just going over what I've painted before with a watery layer, and you can see already that some of the tone is appearing through this. So that's why I did the underpainting, so that I can add tone before I move on to that. And actually that was a really effective technique so that I could have that contrast in layering. So just finishing off adding the red and the pink now, and then what I'm going to do is go back in and add more intense dark areas with that. So working over the top of it again, adding the darker areas in, blending them in, and then working with the red on top to bring that vibrancy to the ribbon, to just create that range of tones in this piece. So I'm just using the red now in certain areas to make that colour more intense. So there is my completed painting. I'm quite happy with it. I've got a range of colours. I feel like I've kind of interpreted the picture properly. I've added my highlights and a range of tones as well, and I really enjoyed using the different colours and building up the layers. Thank you so much for watching, and have a really great day.